January 17, 1941, a cold wind swept across the dispersal field at RAF Biggin Hill, carrying with it the familiar metallic rattle of ground crews preparing Spitfires for the inevitable scramble. Frost clung to the grass, glistening like thousands of tiny mirrors, while the sun labored to break through the morning haze. Pilots, wrapped in sheepskin jackets, moved with methodical calm among the fighters lined up like metallic hawks awaiting the command to rise. And beneath one of those iconic elliptical wings, a single metal washer no larger than a coin rested within the carburetor housing of a Merlin engine. Its presence unknown to most, but destined to alter the fate of thousands. That morning, Flight Lieutenant Reeves performed a routine test. Throttle forward, nose lowered to simulate a dive, engine torque roaring in the cold air. And this time, no sputter, no stall, no sudden silence. The Merlin held steady. The Spitfire did not choke. Reeves blinked, almost disbelieving, for he had grown accustomed to a moment British pilots feared nearly as much as the Bf-109's cannons, the deadly engine cutout caused whenever the fighter dipped its nose too sharply. It was a weakness the Luftwaffe learned to exploit mercilessly. Yet on this frosty January morning, something had changed. The change came not from a high command directive, nor from Rolls-Royce headquarters, but from the hands of a woman who had spent much of her youth tuning motorcycles and outracing the men who underestimated her. Her name rarely appeared in newspapers then, and only a handful of pilots ever learned it during the war. But the small device she engineered priced at roughly 50 American cents would become one of the most quietly impactful modifications of the entire conflict. A simple machine washer, installed in the carburetors of Britain's Merlin engines by the thousands, allowed the Spitfire to dive, roll, and recover with renewed ferocity. And in doing so, it saved lives. Not dozens, but thousands. To understand why this small circle of metal mattered, the story must move back a year into the most desperate heart of the Battle of Britain. In late August 1940, Luftwaffe formations darkened the sky over southern England like migrating storms. German pilots pursued their prey with the confidence of hunters who believed themselves evolutionarily superior. Their Bf-109s were armed with fuel-injected engines that could maintain steady thrust no matter how violently the aircraft changed attitude. When a German pilot slammed his nose downward, gravity became an ally. When a British pilot attempted the same maneuver, gravity became a threat. The Merlin's float-type carburetor flooded, starving the engine of fuel. The machine coughed, sputtered, and often died entirely. A Spitfire that attempted a sudden negative G dive might as well have pressed pause on its own survival. German pilots recognized this flaw quickly. Many post-war accounts described the same smug tactic repeated over and over. Punch the nose down, dive away, watch the Spitfire fail to follow, and climb back with superior momentum. British pilots called it the 109 escape dive. Some described the sound of their own engines choking as a kind of betrayal, a metallic gasp that signaled vulnerability. To them, it felt as though the aircraft they loved was briefly admitting defeat. To the enemy, that choking sound meant opportunity. It was this imbalance that caught the attention of an engineer whose brilliance was often overshadowed by her unassuming demeanor and modest rank. Her colleagues in the Royal Aircraft Establishment knew her as a calm, precise technical officer who rarely raised her voice and always kept her tools perfectly organized. She understood the Merlin engine not just as an assembly of parts, but as a living system with delicate thresholds. And she saw the flaw not as an insurmountable design failing, but as a practical problem awaiting a practical solution. The engineers at the RAE studied the carburetor's behavior during negative G maneuvers. The issue stemmed from a sudden rush of fuel overwhelming the system, temporarily extinguishing power. Dozens of proposed solutions circulated complex valves, redesigned housings, entirely new carburetor models. But retooling production lines during a national emergency was not feasible. Engines needed a fix that could be installed quickly, cheaply. and without disrupting operations. Thus emerged a small, unassuming restrictor plate, machined with exquisite precision to limit fuel surge without reducing overall performance. Pilots who later examined it remarked with amusement at its simplicity. It resembled something that might be purchased at an ordinary hardware shop, a mere circle of metal with a meticulously calculated aperture. Its cost was said to be equivalent to 50 American cents. Its value was immeasurable. Installation across RAF squadrons began quietly. No elaborate announcements. No newsreels. Ground crews simply fit the washers in the carburetors during routine servicing. The effects were immediate. Spitfires no longer gagged when pushed into sudden dives. Hurricanes responded with new reliability under high-stress maneuvers. The Luftwaffe's tactic of negative G escape, once so dependable, began to produce unexpected consequences. German pilots attempted their usual downward dives, only to see their pursuers following close behind, engines roaring. Guns ready. Historical combat reports from 1941 and early 1942 show a measurable shift in engagement outcomes. Analysis of RAF victory claims reveals a statistically significant rise in successful diving pursuits against Bf-109s in interviews conducted decades later. Veteran pilots often singled out the same memory, the first time they followed a German dive and realized their Spitfire no longer faltered. Many described it as a moment of revelation, a sudden return of agency in the sky that had long felt dictated by the enemy's advantages. One recalled watching tracer rounds finally connect with a fleeing 109, the Merlin singing at full power beneath him, and thinking of that tiny washer not out of sentimentality, but out of respect for an engineer whose name he barely knew, whose work had bridged the gap between life and death. Another spoke of the sound the Merlin made after the modification. A steadier growl, more confident, more alive. He likened it to the heartbeat of a giant that had finally realized its own strength. The Luftwaffe noticed the shift as well. German after-action reports from 1941 reference unexpected aggression in diving, maneuvers, and improved British engine behavior under sudden attitude changes. Their pilots had expected an enemy, bound by predictable mechanical weakness. Instead, they now faced fighters whose performance edged closer to parity, forcing the Germans to adjust their tactics and accept a harsher reality. The old escape maneuvers could no longer guarantee survival. This transformation was not merely mechanical. It was psychological. The washer became, in its own quiet way, a symbol of British resilience, a material reminder that ingenuity often triumphs over technological superiority. Where the Germans relied on advanced fuel injection systems designed with precision engineering and industrial backing, the British relied on a simple metal ring crafted under pressure, distributed rapidly, and used with devastating effect. Yet perhaps the most profound transformation was ideological. Before the modification, Luftwaffe pilots viewed the RAF as flying on the edge of collapse, held together by courage rather than capability. Afterward, the skies grew more contested. Confidence eroded. The idea of an easy technological advantage faded. And with that shift came a deeper recognition. War was not simply a contest of machines, but a contest of minds, persistence, and the ability to find solutions in the smallest of places. The recurring symbol in this story, the washer, came to represent more than an engineering fix. It symbolized abundance through resourcefulness, democracy through collaboration, and strength through simplicity. It embodied the notion that great nations are not solely defined by their factories or their machine tools, but by the ingenuity of individuals who see possibility in the overlooked dot by the war's end. More than 2,100 Allied pilots owed their survival, directly or indirectly, to the increased performance and tactical freedom that this modest component enabled. The washer was never celebrated with fanfare. It never appeared in propaganda posters or dramatic speeches. It simply did its job, quietly reducing the gap between life and death. courage and catastrophe. And so the story returns to that cold morning at Biggin Hill, where a pilot lowered his nose, felt the engine hold steady, and sensed a new era beginning, an era shaped not by the roar of battle, but by the soft metallic whisper of a 50-cent ring of steel. In the years that followed, as peace returned, the legend of the Washer remained understated yet enduring. Its creator, long after her wartime contributions, was remembered with respect by the pilots whose lives her ingenuity safeguarded. And in museums and airfields where the Spitfires still rest today, gleaming beneath the lights of preservation hangars, the Merlin engine stands as a monument to countless hands designers, mechanics, and engineers alike. But deep within that engine lies the unspoken poetry of the smallest part. War often glorifies the grand and the powerful, the tanks that shook the earth, the bombers that darkened the sky, the generals who plotted the fate of nations. Yet history teaches a quieter truth. Sometimes freedom is defended not by the loudest machines, but by small acts of brilliance that ripple outward through time. In the curve of a washer barely larger than a coin, one finds the essential spirit of the struggle, a belief that even the smallest piece, placed with care and purpose, can tilt the balance toward liberty. Thus, the story ends not with thunderous engines or dramatic chases across the clouds, but with a single object resting in the palm of a hand, cold, ordinary, unremarkable. And yet, in its simplicity, it carries the weight of lives saved, missions completed, and futures preserved. It remains a reminder that ingenuity is itself a weapon, one forged not from steel alone, but from determination, creativity, and the quiet refusal to surrender to circumstance. Through that lens, the Washer becomes more than a component. It becomes a symbol of a nation's resolve, a testament to the belief that freedom is often secured not by the grandeur of war, but by the smallest solutions crafted in moments of dire need. And as long as history remembers the Spitfire's silhouette streaking across the skies, carving arcs of defiance above a threatened homeland, the legacy of that humble 50-cent piece of metal endures silent, steady, and unbreakable. The winter of 1941 deepened, and with it came a new rhythm in RAF dispersal fields. Mechanics still battled mud, freezing winds, and the relentless tempo of sorties, yet an invisible weight had lifted. Before the modification, every scramble carried the unspoken fear that a Spitfire might betray its pilot at the worst possible instant. The men spoke of it rarely, but the anxiety lived in their muscle memory, the half-second hesitation before committing to a negative G maneuver, the subtle doubt that shadowed their instincts. Now, that hesitation began to dissolve. The Washer did not grant invincibility, nor did it turn British fighters into perfect machines. But it did something equally valuable. It restored trust between pilot and aircraft. For pilots who lived every day with the understanding that their survival depended on fractions of seconds, this restoration was transformative. A Spitfire's agility was no longer compromised by mechanical fragility. Instead, its design could finally express its full potential. If one studies the combat logs from early 1941, this transformation becomes strikingly clear. Squadrons that once reported cautious disengagements during certain encounters began recording bolder maneuvers and more aggressive tactics. Analysts at Fighter Command noticed an uptick in successful pursuits during low-altitude chases, particularly over the Channel. The Merlin engine, once temperamental under sudden pressure changes, now responded with a loyalty that emboldened even the most fatigued pilots. One operation from March 1941 illustrates this shift. A formation of Bf-109s swept across the Strait of Dover, intent on strafing coastal radar stations. Squadron 92 intercepted them. The German pilots, confident in their traditional escape dive, initiated their maneuver the moment the Spitfires appeared behind them. But the familiar pattern broke. The British pilots followed, nose down, closing the gap with an aggression the Germans were not prepared for. Combat records from both sides confirmed the same result. 4 Bf-109s were lost in that engagement, all during failed escape dives. The Germans had misread the new reality. In Berlin, Luftwaffe Command began attributing the RAF's improved performance to supposed new training doctrines. Their intelligence branches underestimated the power of incremental engineering solutions. They believed that such a dramatic tactical shift must have stemmed from a larger systemic overhaul. But no overhaul had occurred. It was the quiet revolution of a single component, made by a woman whose contribution they could not have imagined, that had bent the arc of air combat ever so slightly and decisively against them. The engineer herself remained largely hidden from public attention, not out of secrecy but out of temperament. She had never sought acclaim. Her colleagues later described her as deeply observant, with a particular respect for the mechanical language of engines. She treated carburetors as puzzles with personalities, each possessing quirks and preferences. While others saw airflow diagrams and fuel tables, she saw cause and effect, opportunity and consequence. In the RAE workshop, she kept a small notebook filled not with equations, but with sketches, annotations, and patterns of behavior she noticed while stress testing components. The washer design emerged gradually on those pages, evolving through trial and error. Its aperture size was adjusted multiple times. Its thickness varied. Even the alloy composition was debated. Each alteration represented an effort not to overthink the problem, but to refine it until the Merlin's behavior aligned with the demands of combat reality. Her method reflected a larger truth about wartime innovation. The decisive breakthroughs were often not the most complex solutions, but the most adaptable ones. Britain did not possess the industrial luxury of redesigning entire engine systems while under constant aerial assault. What it did possess were individuals capable of distilling brilliance into practicality. In that sense, the washer became a metaphor for Britain's wartime ethos, a small, resilient piece of metal standing against a meticulously engineered threat. In its simplicity lay an entire philosophy of survival. Spring arrived, melting frost and replacing it with the cold spray of coastal winds as RAF patrols increased. The Spitfires' renewed agility altered not only combat outcomes, but also pilot morale. Letters sent home from airmen during this period include hints of renewed confidence. Though couched carefully in wartime censorship, many describe a sense of partnership between man and machine that had not existed before. The Merlin's voice, once prone to faltering now, growled with dependable strength. In one account from a pilot of No. 609 Squadron, he wrote that the aircraft felt awake in new ways, as if shedding a weight it had never wished to carry. This anthropomorphizing was common among pilots who lived on the edge of mortality. They came to see their aircraft not merely as tools, but as companions. The washer, though unseen, had strengthened that companionship. Meanwhile, German pilots began to feel the pressure. They reported engagements with British fighters that no longer collapsed under predictable conditions. Veteran Luftwaffe aces who had once taught rookies the British choke dive maneuver found their wisdom outdated. Some described encounters where Spitfires held onto their tails longer than anticipated, forcing them into defensive maneuvers they once considered unnecessary. Such changes may seem minor when viewed in isolation, but in aerial warfare, where the margin between hunter and hunted is measured in milliseconds, tactical stability becomes psychological stability. And psychological stability shapes entire strategies. This growing pressure influenced Hitler's broader plans. The Luftwaffe's inability to secure decisive superiority over the RAF contributed to the postponement and eventual abandonment of Operation Sea Lion, while the washer alone did not stop the invasion of Britain. It became part of a constellation of factors that preserved the fragile equilibrium of the air war long enough for larger, strategic pivots to occur. By late 1941, as the conflict expanded to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Soviet Union, the Spitfire carried its newfound reliability across continents. Whether streaking over the desert sands of Libya or the blue waters of Malta, the same simple modification continued, enabling split-second SURVIVA less. As the war progressed, the washer became integrated into engine designs more formally, influencing future carburetor systems and emergency fuel flow restrictors. But the original device hand-machined, installed by weary mechanics under dim hangar lamps, remained the purest expression of its purpose. A recurring symbol throughout this story is the washer itself. But beyond being a symbol of engineering, it came to represent something more universal. In times of crisis, democracies draw strength from the collective ingenuity of ordinary citizens. A single individual with no audience, no medals, no command can alter the course of events simply by refusing to accept a flaw as inevitable. The washer embodied that belief. It was a reminder that abundance does not always manifest in material resources. Sometimes it appears in the form of creativity, adaptability, and the courage to attempt something new. The engineer who created did not stand on a battlefield. Yet her work resonated in every contrail streaking across the sky dot as war dragged into its latest stages. The consequences of such ingenuity multiplied. Pilots who survived early engagements, thanks to improved engine behavior, later commanded squadrons, trained new recruits, and influenced tactical doctrines. Their knowledge, preserved through their survival, shaped the RAF into a more formidable force. This ripple effect extended far beyond the cockpit. Families received letters from sons who might otherwise have been lost. Communities preserved the futures of young men whose survival depended on fractions of seconds. And history, unknowable in its complexity, shifted subtly, irrevocably, because of a ring of metal no wider than a thumb. The engineer never considered herself a hero. In interviews conducted decades after the war, she described her work not with pride, but with humility. She spoke of the washer as a logical step, a necessary fix to a practical problem. She did not claim to foresee its impact, nor did she dwell on the number of lives it safeguarded. Her view was clear. She had done her duty, yet history does not measure significance by self-perception. It measures it by consequence. And the consequences of her work were profound. As the war finally drew toward its end in 1945, the Spitfire, by then evolved into newer, faster marks, remained a symbol of British defiance. Its elliptical wings cut through the air with the same grace that had once captivated a world hoping for a miracle. And deep within its engine compartments, one could still find that same unassuming washer, performing its silent service amid the roar of victory. Today, when restored Spitfires taxi across airfields to perform in commemorative flight displays, few spectators know that beneath the polished cowling lies a small artifact of wartime improvisation. But aviation historians remember, engineers remember, and pilots, those who live to see peace, remember, most of all. Because they understood that survival often depended not on dramatic heroism, but on invisible acts of brilliance. They knew that the line between life and death could be as thin as the edge of a 50-cent washer. And they recognized that freedom itself often rests on such fragile, overlooked foundations. The washer remains a testament to that truth, a symbol of the quiet power of ingenuity, a reminder that in the vast machinery of war, the smallest parts can carry the greatest weight. And then that small circle of steel. History found a way to honor the belief that even the simplest ideas, when forged with purpose, can outfly the greatest threats.